And maybe firstly, just to say, it is very important to have events like this, to talk on the economy and to interrogate ideas on the economy. The interesting part of it, if you look, since 1994, it's actually very rare that we have public discussions on the economy. Just think about it. I mean, we talk a lot about politics. We talk a lot often about the state, but we almost never talk openly about the economy. And it is very, very important. And it's also very important, I mean, you know, we potentially facing an economic disaster. And why I'm saying that, on the 1st of August, we're having a tariff deadline, US tariff deadline. And I know we've been talking about the economy, but we have to talk about the economy in the context of the US tariff deadline and what it could mean for our economy if we don't get a deal. Obviously, the sad part of it is, so far, I mean, our government and most of the ANC has not engaged or has wrongly engaged with the US. A couple of weeks ago, Lesotho declared its own economy as a disaster because of the impact of the tariffs on them. So that really is something we have to factor in, particularly in the context of, first, I don't think we will make that deadline. I mean, I have proposed to some of our GNU parties to ask for an extension. Possibly that's most probably the only way that we can deal with it. I think the second thing that was to be very important is for civil societies, for non-states, for business to also engage with the US. I think it's very, very important, and I want to repeat that. It is very, very important as a society. We're not only politics, and we're not only the state, and we're not only political parties. Civil society, business, intellectuals, we are all part of the state. So we have to look at the state not only as the government. I mean, a few years ago, I was commissioned by the states to do a report, in fact, in 2009, 2010, on state capacity. And I suggested that maybe we have to reimagine how we think about the state, that the state is not, in the way we look at the state is not just, you know, government institutions, but the state actually involves business, civil society, and other non-state institutions. So if you look at a state that way, it becomes different. So if you look at this, because then it means we can have co-delivery from business and from professionals and from civil society. So it's a reimagining the state as different rather than as in a narrow way we look at it. So if we then see the state as beyond conventionally our government or politicians, then it would be very, very important for civil society to actually engage with the US. I mean, just a couple of days ago, I was in a closed session with US officials, for example. And I thought it was very, very important that we, as non-state people, engage and offer ways of the US to engage with us if the US is not getting anything out of our own state. And so on. And that is very, very important because there is no conversation, well, no real conversation. And if we do nothing also as the non-state or outside our conventional states, we leave it open, we leave that vacuum open, and so on. So that really is important. Coming back to that report, I mean, just an anecdote, 2009, you know that my state capacity report was rejected. It was shredded, very angry by one cabinet minister. He actually symbolically shredded it. I'm not going to name names, and so on. because Christo, maybe is what you were saying in terms of that we are so ideological, and maybe one of the reasons why we haven't gotten the growth is because we've been too ideological and not pragmatic enough. So ideological rigidity has been a reason, has undermined economic growth in our country. The fact that we're so rigidly ideological, it is actually undermined economic growth, because it also undermines our imagination, because once individuals, but also once a government is ideologically rigid, it narrows the capacity to think outside the box, to think about on new ideas, to come up with new ideas, and so on. So let me get to my presentation. I think let me start with the Government of National Unity. I think it's very important to start with the Government of National Unity because we're facing a crisis. Firstly, we're sitting in an economic crisis, and the crisis can be bigger because unless we deal with the US, the tariff deadline. But I think the Government of National Unity offers us actually a structure to deal with the crisis better. Now, imagine if it was just a monopoly ANC government now, we would have been, this crisis would have been even worse. I mean, we can't even imagine what's worse, but it would have been worse. So at least now we've got a Government of National Unity. So there's a couple of things about the Government of National Unity, why it is important. Because, for the first time, it is a diversity of ideas. And I am going to repeat the diversity because I think our growth, economic growth, our opportunities lie in our diversity. So we have to think about diversity-led economic growth. And then we have to think about diversity-led democracy building. So those are the two, and diversity-led nation building also. So diversity is a key thing. If countries are, every country has something that differentiates a country. The thing that differentiates us is our diversity, and it is very, very important that we have to emphasize this. Our economic growth actually sits there, and one of the reasons why we haven't gotten the economic growth is also because we have not leverage the diversity. Sadly, many people in the country do think that our diversity is an obstacle to development and to economic growth. I mean, that's very, very wrong. Our diversity is actually the basis of our economic growth. And because we've marginalized and underemphasized our diversity, that's the reason why we also have had low growth. But it's not only on the economic side where diversity is important, it is important also, as I say, on our democracy building, because democracy building cannot be a narrow project. It cannot be a project driven by only one group, with a political group and so on. It is a diverse, we have to use a diverse platform. The same with nation building. Nation building is not a project by one group. It is a diversity-based project. And because, our nation building project is also in a crisis, and one reason for that crisis is the fact that we have not built on our diversity. We've not taken diversity as the center of our nation building project. So, diversity-led growth, diversity-led democracy, and the idea that one party, one color, one group on its own cannot bring us prosperity in a country, and that's very important. And diversity is our opportunity. I mean, even just think about this, the opportunity now with U.S. Administration, because we have a diverse GNU, gives us the ability, different parts of that GNU, to engage with the US. If the US has a problem with the ANC, there are other parts of the GNU that can engage, and also other parts of society that can engage with the US. And I think it would have been worse if the other parts, if the non-ANC people did not engage with the US. It would have been, I mean, the situation would have been worse. I promise you that. So I would encourage people, I would encourage civil society groups to engage with the US. And so on, if the state is not there doing it. And you can always say, look, it is based on a 2009 state capacity report, which was paid by taxpayers' money, and which argued that the state involves civil society, business, and the non-state. Right? I did not want to put my computer on top. Pragmatism is the other, and pragmatism-led growth. So if we had tried the last 30 years to, if the ANC has put ideologically driven economic reforms, we now have to look at pragmatic or pragmatism as a way of driving growth. And that's, I think, the beauty of the GNU, because once you force groups together from different parties and different colors, you have to come to a midpoint pragmatically. And that's the beauty of a GNU. It compels people who may have been unwilling to work and collaborate together to become pragmatic in the interests of the country. So very, very important that pragmatism in making policies, in pursuing economic reform, pragmatism is very, very important. I mean, all of the great economic reforms since the Second World War, all of them in other countries, whereas in Japan after the Second World War, is policies based on pragmatism. Whereas in Singapore, we'll let you raise the issue of Singapore. I mean, it's pragmatic policies. Korea, it is pragmatic policies. Even in China, the post-Deng period, so the growth that they're seeing now, pragmatic policies. Even in India, in the big growth after 1990 under Manmohan Singh, when he was elected as prime minister, and he changed the game. He moved from a liberation movement, sort of ideologically driven reforms towards pragmatism. That laid the basis for economic growth in India. So pragmatism is almost a philosophy, it's almost an ideology on its own. So can we, from a South African point of view, focus all of our state initiatives, our economic initiatives, even our nation-building initiatives on pragmatism? What works? What is practical? What is in the interest of everyone? I mean, that's pragmatism, in the interest of everyone. And so that, for me, is a very, very important part of any of the economic reforms we want to do. So pragmatism-led economic growth. Then what we need to do is remove anti-growth policies. I mean, there are many of them. I'm not going to go all. And maybe we have to start, many people are not convinced about the idea of economic growth. I mean, there are many people I speak to who do not believe, and many people in the ANC do not believe in economic growth as something to drive development. And you may think that's very far-fetched, but if you look even in the African history of liberation and independence movements since the end of colonialism, very few liberation movements, African liberation movements in power, pursued economic growth. I mean, economic growth was not even on the agenda. It's Mauritius and so on, and in Botswana, where they pursued economic growth as a philosophy to get economic growth. And you can see the difference between Mauritius and Botswana versus the other countries that did not pursue economic growth. There are many people who wrongly believe that economic growth is a neoliberal concept. It's a World Bank concept. It's the same with SMEs. There are many people in the ANC who think, if you talk about SMEs as the basis of development, they say, no, there's World Bank inspired. They're not very enthusiastic about SME-led growth, for example. So again, that is where I'm saying moving from ideology to pragmatism to get through the economic growth that we want. I mean, maybe two anti-growth policies. I mean, one for me is obviously the expropriation without compensation law. I mean, the third part of it is I headed, so in at the end of 2017, Cabinet approached me to head an 18-month report, a review of all state-owned land and property. I mean, I brought together almost all of Wits University across the disciplines, and we worked on a report, on a review of all state-owned land and property. Beginning of 2019, we handed over the report, which was adopted by Cabinet. And in that report, I made very, very clear recommendations that if as a country, we enact any expropriation laws without compensation, it will hit the economy. And I explained in the report what property rights, that property rights are very wide. Property rights includes pension funds, it includes intellectual property, and so on, and you know, shares, bonds, you know, institutional investors from abroad and locally. These are all property rights, and it's the basis. Property rights is the basis of a modern economy. And once you hit property rights, you hit an economy. And I also explained 3 case studies. I did 3 case studies. And not only did I explain it, but I also addressed, between 2017 and 2019, most of our political parties, the leaders of our political parties, and the parliamentary caucuses of our political parties around it. So between 2017 and 2019, and try to explain to them the idea, what does it mean, property rights. I did 3 case studies. The first was Algeria, because, you know, Algeria originally introduced an expropriation law without compensation after their independence. Now, Algeria, it took Algeria over 30 years to recover from that. Over 30 years. So at the beginning, when they enacted the law, Algeria, I mean, Nigeria was an big agriculture exporter to Europe. Algeria almost never recovered, and Algeria is now still the second biggest importer of food. So, you know, it flipped from an exporter, it is now importer. They've been consistently after the law. And not only that, I actually made a case and an argument actually that the consequences of that law and the way it hit Algeria, it actually was a major contributor to the civil war in the early 90s, because the civil war in the early 90s was based on an economic crisis, a long economic crisis. And a long economic crisis started with that expropriation law. So that was the one case study. The second case study I did was in Tanzania, because Tanzania was the second country that introduced that law. I mean, it's hit Tanzania to such an extent that Tanzania at that time, you have to think about the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, Tanzania experienced the highest inflation that the world has ever seen in the 1970s. And in 1980, the Tanzanian government in 1980 set up a commission, and their commission concluded that the reason for the crisis in Tanzania is actually squarely with that expropriation law without compensation. So a formal inquiry in 1980, a formal inquiry. It is there, you can Google the inquiry. I mean, I saw, actually, it's somebody just put it on Google now. and so on, right? And they denounced in that inquiry, and that inquiry was a government inquiry, it was not an external inquiry. And then obviously we know Zimbabwe, what it did when they introduced their law. I mean, they then became, after Tanzania actually had the highest inflation, so it was initially Tanzania and then Zimbabwe and so on. So we recommended in that report for cabinets, and again, I explained to the non-ANC GNU partners they need to follow up on that because the report was adopted by cabinet. It's very, very important. Once it's adopted by cabinet, it is the duty of cabinet then to implement. We suggested two things to deal with land reform. One, to make surplus state land available as the main part of land reform. I mean, we, in our report and our review of state-owned land, and most of the land in South Africa is owned by the state. Some land, the state doesn't even know that it owns the land, right? So if you make that land available to people, to poor people, it will make a big difference. And the second one, which I think was much more controversial, because is to give title deeds to people in communal areas. I mean, let me tell you how significant the title deeds. 2/3 of all the land in KwaZulu-Natal is in communal hands. So, people are on land, they can't use it for any commercial purposes. So if you're going to do land reform, that's the first thing you do. The same in North Wales, the same in the Eastern Cape, and so on. I mean, I made a case study also for cabinet for them to understand the concept. I said even in China, and China didn't go all the way. What China did, and I think, with the Deng reforms, what they did was that they brought, let's call it a property, sort of a midway point property right, where they gave long leases to farmers that they owned a property and they could use it for in a property market and all sorts of as the rights, and that actually was the beginning of the transformation of China, and that is why China, one of the reasons why China and the Chinese system survived and the Soviet Union, Soviet Union didn't. It's the property. They brought in not full property rights in the beginning, but they started off, and of course they brought in fuller property rights because you can own businesses and so on, because that's a property right, and so on. So we try to make it, from a cabinet point of view, as clear as possible with examples around the world, and so on. So that's coming back to that. That's one of the first policies that should go. It's anti-growth policy, and then there's obviously the NHI, the bill. It's an anti-growth policy that we have to get rid of, and we have to find a midway, a partnership between the private sector and the health sector to deal with our health issue, and then BE in its current form that we really have to get rid of. Again, in 2009, I mean, there was actually one of the first reports when I came back home after living abroad for a while. It was actually the first report that I was commissioned by the state, wasn't on black economic empowerment in 2009. And it was based on the fact that in 2002, I was commissioned by the Economist Intelligence Unit, so Economist is a magazine. They'd asked me to do a long view of empowerment programs in Africa since colonialism. That report is actually online. So in 2002 report where I looked at empowerment programs since the end of colonialism in Africa, so Ghana, Nigeria, and so on. 2002, it was the Economist Intelligence Unit. They come up with these yearly reports, big reports on specific issues. And I looked at our one. So we have to sift to alternative ways of empowerment. And what is alternative ways of empowerment? So we start off with empowerment, because the way empowerment is structured now is structured on giving politically connected ANC leaders and trade union leaders shares in existing companies. So that's absolutely wrong. What we need to do is moving it to SMEs and bringing small business into the supply chains and into manufacturing. So supply chains and manufacturing as alternative ways, that's the first. And secondly, what we need to do is to bring skills to reward skills training, and reward employment. So empowerment becomes, if you employ young people, that's an empowerment. And bring into an education. If you adopt a school, if you do something, that's empowerment. And in not just education, but a particular kind of education, your sort of STEM, your science, your technology education, and so on. So alternative ways of empowerment. And that's how we have to look at this. And assets. If a company, say if a mining company builds public infrastructure, that's empowerment. If it builds housing, that's empowerment. And that's how we have to look at empowerment. And then for me, even more important, if one creates new sectors in South Africa that do not exist, that's empowerment. I mean, we know there is the microchip industry, which is at the forefront of global development now. Now, if businesses develop those sort of sectors, new sectors that we don't have, that the world needs, that's empowerment. So it's really a reimagining of what empowerment is. So you take it out of the color, yes, because blacks are the majority poor, so a lot of the things, the development is going to be naturally, is going to be prioritizing black South Africans, because black South Africans are the majority. I think I've got 5 minutes, yep. You know, we have to talk about the state. We absolutely have to talk about the states as part of the economic reform. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the reform, but I'm going to take you through. I was part of the 2001 to 2003. President Ramaphosa's task team on the professionalization of the public service. So, unfortunately, none of the recommendations were implemented. Right. So the failure of our state is also a reason why we have low economic growth. Our state failure is actually part of it. I mean, Molechi, we're talking about, so I'm not going to repeat on this, on a sort of the salary bill, the wage bill, and so on, because I think it's done a really good job in explaining that. So I'll tell you just our recommendations on what to do. Is essentially we need to reform the public sector, but to be practical, what we suggested is to say, let's look at the catalytic parts of the state and focus our reform on that. We can't do everything. So let's focus on the catalytic parts. What are the catalytic parts of the state? Is the economic entities of the state? Is the infrastructure entities of the state? So, let's say, the government department, national government departments, which are the departments that are key to economic growth? So we tackle that. We bring merit-based appointments there. We deal with corruption. We hold them accountable. There's going to be other parts of the state. We're not going to have the time to focus on it. Let's just focus on, in the short term, on the core. And then the same with the state-owned entities. Let's focus on the infrastructure state-owned entities. Let's clean them up. Let's get the merit-based appointments. Let's deal with the procurement. Let's deal with the DFIs. Your state financial institutions, deal with them. And then look at the municipalities. I mean, just on a calculation, it was very interesting. Mulechi was just saying, from a wage bill, if we include the municipalities, it becomes a massive wage bill. So if we look only at the municipalities that are catalytic, and we deal with them, and we leave for now the other ones. I think it will deliver us something. And the same with the state-owned entities. And again, I'll take you to a report in 2010, the Presidential Review Committee on State-Owned Entities, which I was the chief advisor to them. And one of the things that I put in that report was, even though state-owned entity reforms, the way the Chinese, for example, did their reforms, they're only focusing on the catalytic state-owned entities. They make it as professional as possible. They tough on it, and sadly, all of the sort of others, the non-economically relevant entities, they wait later to deal with them, while they're dealing with the growth entities. Last one is just in terms of corruption. Now, corruption is very important, and again, because people don't think about corruption. If we reduce corruption, if we made the calculations, if we could reduce corruption between 5 and 10%, just between 5, let's be generous, but if we reduce it between 5 and 20%, it will give us an extra 3 to 4% growth. It would. And I've done all the comparisons, looks around the world, from Indonesia and so on, for the states to show how you can do it. If we just seriously reduce it, and I say, let's say we generous and we say like a 10% or to a 15%, we can get a 3% just out of that economic growth. Thank you.